In 1859, a bankrupt businessman walked into a San Francisco newspaper office and declared himself Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. For the next 21 years, Joshua Norton issued imperial decrees, commanded imaginary armies, and wore a military uniform complete with gold epaulets and a plumed hat. San Francisco not only accepted him, they loved him. Restaurants fed him for free. The city printed his own currency, and when he died, over 10,000 people attended his funeral. But here's the strangest part. Some of his military ideas, dismissed as the ravings of a madman, actually influenced real military and political thinking. This is the bizarre true story of America's only emperor, and how a San Francisco eccentric's imaginary command structure predicted real changes in American governance and military organization. In this video, you'll discover who Joshua Norton really was, how he became Emperor Norton I, the military proclamations he issued, why San Francisco embraced rather than rejected him, and the surprising ways his ideas influenced actual policy discussions. Using historical records, newspaper archives, and analysis from historians, we're exploring one of the strangest intersections between mental illness, performance art, and genuine political insight in American history. Joshua Abraham Norton was born around 1818, most likely in England, though some records suggest South Africa. He arrived in San Francisco in 1849 during the gold rush with a substantial inheritance of $40,000, an enormous sum at the time. Norton was a savvy businessman who made smart investments in real estate and commodities. By the mid-1850s, he had turned that $40,000 into $250,000. He was respected, successful, and on his way to becoming one of San Francisco's wealthiest citizens. Then came his downfall. In 1852, China experienced a severe famine that created a rice shortage. Norton learned that Peru had a surplus and saw an opportunity. He attempted to corner the San Francisco rice market by buying up massive quantities of Peruvian rice at 12 cents per pound, planning to sell it at a huge markup when shortages drove prices up. But Norton miscalculated badly. Several other ships arrived with rice, flooding the market. Prices collapsed to 3 cents per pound. Norton lost everything. He tried to void his contracts through legal action, but the courts ruled against him. By 1858, Joshua Norton was bankrupt, broken, and had disappeared from San Francisco society. When he resurfaced in September 1859, he had transformed. Norton walked into the offices of the San Francisco Bulletin and handed them a proclamation. At the peremptory request of a large majority of the citizens of these United States, I, Joshua Norton, declare and proclaim myself Emperor of these United States. He signed it Norton I, Emperor of the United States. The newspaper, perhaps amused or recognizing good copy when they saw it, published it. And just like that, America had an emperor. Norton's transformation wasn't just psychological theater. He fully committed to the role. He obtained a blue military uniform with gold epaulets, likely from the British Army, and added a beaver hat with peacock feathers and a rosette. He carried a cane or ceremonial sword. He looked every bit the military commander and head of state. And he began issuing proclamations on everything from political corruption to urban planning to military organization. Many of his early decrees were political. He abolished Congress, declaring it was corrupt and ineffective. He ordered the army to remove Congress by force. When this didn't happen, he dissolved Congress again, this time with more elaborate reasoning. He declared that both the Democratic and Republican parties were abolished. He ordered the arrest of various congressmen for ignoring his previous decrees. None of this had any legal effect, of course, but Norton was absolutely serious in his pronouncements. What's remarkable is how San Francisco responded. Rather than institutionalizing Norton or driving him away, the city embraced him. Restaurant owners gave him free meals, often reserving a special table for the emperor. Theaters provided him with seats, usually the best in the house. He attended performances, and his presence was noted in reviews. The city's newspapers published his proclamations regularly, treating them with mock seriousness that was somehow also genuinely respectful. When Norton's uniform wore out, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted to provide him with a new one, paid for by the city. Norton took his military authority seriously. He issued commands regarding the organization of armed forces. One of his decrees called for the establishment of a League of Nations-style international military council that could prevent wars through collective security. This was in the 1860s, decades before the actual League of Nations. Another proclamation demanded that a bridge be built across San Francisco Bay to connect the city with Oakland. At the time, this seemed absurd. The bay was miles wide, the technology seemed impossible, and the cost would be astronomical. The Bay Bridge was eventually built in 1936, 60 years after Norton's death. His military proclamations became more elaborate during the Civil War. Norton issued orders to both Union and Confederate forces, commanding them to cease hostilities and recognize his authority as emperor. He attempted to mediate the conflict through imperial decree. Obviously, neither side paid any attention, but Norton's proclamations about the war were sometimes remarkably insightful. He recognized that the conflict was tearing the nation apart in ways that would take generations to heal. He proposed reconstruction plans that, while impractical coming from a powerless eccentric, contained ideas that real policymakers would later echo. Norton also concerned himself with military infrastructure. He issued orders for the construction of a tunnel under San Francisco Bay, another project that seemed impossible in the 1860s but was eventually completed. He demanded improvements to the city's fortifications and military readiness. He ordered a complete survey of California's coast for defensive purposes. None of these orders were followed in his lifetime, but they showed Norton was thinking strategically about defense and infrastructure in ways that anticipated future developments. The most fascinating aspect of Norton's reign was his relationship with actual military personnel. Naval officers visiting San Francisco sometimes paid courtesy calls on Emperor Norton, treating him with the respect due a head of state. Was this mockery? Not entirely. Contemporary accounts suggest that many of these officers genuinely enjoyed Norton's company and admired his dignity. Army officers stationed in San Francisco sometimes acknowledged his proclamations with formal but tongue-in-cheek responses. Norton existed in a strange space between delusion and performance art, and military professionals seemed to understand that engaging with him harmed nothing and brought joy to an obviously troubled but harmless man. Norton's currency is another remarkable element of his story. He issued his own money, bonds bearing his seal and signature, in denominations ranging from 50 cents to $10. These had no legal standing, yet many San Francisco businesses accepted them. Why? Partly out of affection for Norton, but also because the bonds became collectibles. Some people valued Norton's currency more than U.S. currency because of its novelty and the genuine affection people had for the emperor. His military thinking, filtered through his delusions, sometimes touched on genuinely important issues. Norton repeatedly called for the abolition of political parties, arguing they divided the nation unnecessarily. This isn't an uncommon critique, and George Washington himself had warned against partisan factions. Norton demanded transparency in government and an end to corruption. He called for infrastructure improvements that would benefit common people rather than just the wealthy. These weren't crazy ideas. They were progressive political positions that happened to come from someone who believed he was emperor. The question historians debate is how much of Norton was genuinely delusional versus how much was performance.
Was he truly mentally ill? Or was he a brilliant performance artist who found a way to live comfortably by creating an elaborate character? The truth is probably a mix of both. Norton clearly suffered some kind of mental break after his financial ruin. The delusion of being emperor provided a way to rebuild his identity after the humiliation of bankruptcy. But he was also intelligent, witty, and aware enough to maintain his performance consistently for over 2 decades. Norton patrolled San Francisco daily, inspecting the city and its citizens. He checked that streets were clean, that police were doing their jobs, and that businesses were operating fairly. People greeted him respectfully as Emperor Norton. Children were told to bow or curtsy. He attended public events, and his arrival was announced. In many ways, Norton functioned as a de facto moral authority. When he complained about something, businesses often corrected it, not because they had to, but because disappointing the emperor would disappoint the community. There's one famous incident that reveals San Francisco's relationship with Norton. In 1867, a new police officer, unaware of Norton's status, arrested him for involuntary treatment as a vagrant and mentally disturbed person. The public was outraged. Newspapers condemned the arrest. The police chief personally apologized to Norton and ordered his immediate release. Norton, displaying the grace expected of royalty, issued an imperial pardon to the officer who arrested him. After that, police officers saluted Emperor Norton when they saw him on the street. Norton's military influence, such as it was, came not from any real authority but from the fact that he made people think. His proclamation calling for a bridge across the bay seemed ridiculous until engineers proved it was possible. His call for a League of Nations-style organization seemed like fantasy until the actual League of Nations formed. His demands for political reform echoed concerns that many Americans shared but couldn't articulate as boldly. Norton, freed from the constraints of sanity and social convention, could say things that others only thought. Did military leaders read Norton's proclamations and change their thinking? Probably not directly.
But Norton was part of the cultural conversation in San Francisco, and San Francisco was a major city with national influence. His ideas circulated. They were discussed in newspapers. They entered the realm of public discourse. Some of his infrastructure proposals were eventually realized not because anyone followed his decrees, but because he identified genuine needs that became obvious to everyone else over time. Norton died on January 8, 1880, collapsing on a San Francisco street corner. He was 71 years old, though his exact age was uncertain. The city went into mourning. Newspapers published elaborate obituaries. His funeral was one of the largest San Francisco had ever seen, with over 10,000 mourners attending. Flags flew at half-mast. The city that had embraced its emperor now mourned him genuinely. Norton was buried in a modest grave. But in 1934, San Francisco businessmen funded his reburial in a prominent cemetery with a headstone reading Norton I, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. The legacy of Emperor Norton is complex. He was clearly mentally ill, a man whose delusions were enabled by a community that found him entertaining and harmless. But he was also beloved, a figure who brought joy and unity to a rough frontier city. His military proclamations and political decrees were powerless, yet some of his ideas eventually came to pass. He commanded no armies, controlled no territory, and wielded no real authority, yet he influenced his community through sheer force of personality and the community's willingness to engage with his fantasy. Modern psychologists might diagnose Norton with various conditions, perhaps a delusional disorder triggered by the trauma of financial ruin. But diagnosis doesn't fully explain the phenomenon of Emperor Norton. He created an alternative identity that served psychological needs while also providing social value. He made people happy. He gave them a shared story, a character they could all participate in creating. In a strange way, Norton built community through his delusion. The military aspect of Norton's story is the most interesting from our perspective. Here was a man with no military training, no authority, and no forces, issuing military commands and strategic directives. Some were pure fantasy. Others showed surprising foresight. Norton understood that infrastructure was military strategy. He recognized that San Francisco's geography required connections that seemed technologically impossible. He grasped that military power alone couldn't solve political problems, and that international cooperation might prevent wars. Were these insights original to Norton? Probably not, but Norton articulated them publicly and persistently in ways that entered public consciousness. The bridge he demanded was eventually built. The international organization he proposed eventually formed. The political reforms he called for slowly occurred. Norton didn't cause any of these things, but he was part of the cultural environment that made them thinkable. Emperor Norton remains one of American history's most fascinating minor characters. He was a failed businessman who reinvented himself as royalty, a mentally ill man who became a beloved public figure, a powerless eccentric whose proclamations occasionally contained genuine wisdom. San Francisco's embrace of Norton says as much about the city as about the man himself. In the wild, anything-goes atmosphere of Gold Rush, California, there was room for an emperor, and San Francisco was better for having one. Today, Emperor Norton is remembered fondly. Streets and businesses bear his name. Historical markers note his favorite haunts. He appears in novels, plays, and comics. He represents something uniquely American, the idea that identity is malleable, that community can be built around shared stories, and that sometimes the line between madness and genius is harder to draw than we'd like to admit. Emperor Norton commanded imaginary armies, but his real power was making people think, smile, and imagine a city that could make room for an emperor who had no throne but was royalty nonetheless.